Hello world and welcome back to Money Makes Games. This is going to be part 5 of our series on how to create your very first game. In this case it's going to be something like Pong and we'll call it Pong-ish. Let's go. My name is Money and I make games. Now, before we go on, I want to ask you a little favor. If you've been following this series, why don't you talk to me about it? Let me know in the comments on whether or not you like this raw style. You like seeing people suffer? Just kidding. But I think you understand what I mean. Do you want me to just have a more polished video that shows you how to get things done and bang, we're over? Or do you actually want to know what the process is and what my thoughts are behind this? Let me know down in the comments. Alright, let's do a quick recap and then we'll finish up something in the player script before moving on. Now, as you can remember, we have a player. We are able to move our player with its script, and we have our ball, which gets moved and reset whenever we score. We determine whether or not the ball has entered the score zone by having these score trigger objects. Now basically these are just box colliders that are set as triggers with a script attached to it that tells us when to score. Well, you know, when the box has been entered. Alright, we're going to use that soon, so keep it in mind. But first let's finish something on our player. Now, in our player script currently, we are still determining our speed with a hard-coded number, which is 4 down here. Oh, we want to change this. In fact, we want to serialize it so that if we want to change it, we can just go directly in the editor and change it even while we're playing. That way it makes it easier for us to test and to tune. So let's take over here, we'll create a serialized variable. I'll say serialized field, float, speed, and we'll give that a default value of 4. Okay, if we want to change that later, we can change it in the inspector, and then we'll just replace our 4 there with speed. Let's save, and we'll jump back in here. As you go on with your programming journey, you might end up working in a team where you have game designers and programmers. So if you're the programmer, you want to make it easy for the game designer to change stuff without actually having to go into your code or to tell you to change something in the code. And in that regard, serialized fields are very, very useful. So let's see. On our ball script, not ball, on our player script, there we go. We now have our speed as a serialized field. Now let's move our player around a bit and see if this has any effect. There's our player. That's a pretty steady speed, a little boring and slow. Let's make that 10 and see how it goes. That's a little faster and I think a little better for playing. Alright, we'll stop that. As you can see, changes we made during play mode don't stay, so after we go back to edit mode, we just go 10 because we want that change to stick. Okay, so now our next objective is going to be to actually display a score. And for that, we're going to need two places to show our score, one for player 1 and one for player 2. And we will also need, well, we'll probably need a second player to play against. So let's see what we can do. Firstly, to display our score, let's add two text boxes. So we go UI and we go to Textmesh. Down here to Textmesh Pro. Now, if you haven't imported TMP Essentials yet, you can do it here. If you don't have the package, you need to go to your package manager and install it from there. I'm not going to install the examples and extras, just to show you. If you don't have it, go to package manager under window. And make sure you get packages from the Unity registry. And you can just type here Textmesh Pro. These things take a little while, but I think you get the idea. As soon as Textmesh Pro actually shows up, you can click on it here and you can go install, or in my case, update, which I'm not going to do right now. Okay, so let's do, you can see it created a canvas for us. Canvas is mostly where you will be displaying your user interface stuff. So text boxes, images that are not sprites, input boxes, buttons, that type of thing. You get different types of canvases. The one we're going to be using today is called the screen space overlay, which basically just means that it's going to fill the screen space, which is now shown over here in this big rectangle. You can also get a world space canvas, which is in the world, but we're not going to talk about that right now. And because this is an overlay, anything on this canvas will be in front of anything that's in our world, which is over here. Now, let's just look at this. We've got a little complaint here where it says normal and tangent are not used, so we can just take that out. Normal and tangent most often. Okay, just take out tangent. Oh, come on. Doesn't seem to be willing to take it out right now. And we can just tick that. All right, this is what I want to get to. Now, your canvas scaler, you can use constant pixel size, which is not very adaptive. So if you're going to be building for different screen sizes, like if you're building for mobile especially, there's going to be a lot of different screen sizes. You want to go with scale with screen size, and then have a reference resolution that fits the one you're currently using. Now, right here in my game window, I've got an aspect ratio of 16:9, and I'm actually using a full HD screen resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. So if you use that there, you should get a pretty good idea of what your final display will look like on most people's displays. And because the canvas scaler will scale to fit the other displays, it should work out for, well, basically anyway, any display with the same orientation at the moment. There are also tricks that we can do to accommodate displays that have portrait mode and so on, but I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. Okay, then you can choose match width or height, and you can give that a weight. So if you're more worried about just matching the width of the screen, bring your slider all the way here. If you want to balance it out, bring it slightly to the middle. Otherwise, if you don't mind the width of the screen, but the height is important to you, which I think in this case it is, we would rather match the height and maybe lose a bit on the sides. Okay, that's just a quick one on canvases. You can go read up on that in the Unity documentation. It's actually very interesting and useful. But if you follow this, this should work for you most of the time. Right, now that we've talked about the canvas and we have our text box, you can see it shows up here. Now, canvas objects have what they call a rectangle transform. And here you can set the alignment for your rectangle transform. Excuse me. If you click here, you'll see you can align it to the top left, middle, top right. You can have it stretched to fit the width. And there are many other options. You can even have it stretched to fit the whole screen. If you actually click on this and you go Alt, then it will automatically Alt click, move to the center, because we've got here, we want it at the top there. It also tells you it will set the pivot for you if you go Shift. Now the pivot is basically the point around which your text object scales, or your object scales and rotates. I'm going to go do that and set the pivot to the top, and then these indicate fixed anchor points that will set the dimensions. So if you want to have really fine control over your placement and the look of your, or the size of your object, you can put it here, and these will scale in and out with the screen size. Now I want this one slightly off to this side and put my anchor points here. And then we'll name this layer 2 score. We click here, we go Control D. Move the other one over here. Maybe slightly this way. Like that. And then we'll call that player 1 score. Okay, now it would have made more sense for me to set my Textmesh Pro options before I duplicated, but you can also just select both of these by control clicking, and then you can set all the properties that they have in common at the same time. So let's say we want to make the font a little smaller or bigger. We can do that here. You can even do an auto size for the font, so it just fits. To tune that, we can go, let's make this 999, and we'll call that our maximum score. Oh, maybe we want 4-digit scores, so let's add another one, just so you can get an idea of what this is going to look like. And then you can also set the alignment inside the box. You can set it to the center of the box, and also to the middle. In other words, this is horizontal and this is vertical center. You can also set options like the overflow, where how it handles overflow. So does it clip off the text? Does it just let it run over the box? There's a lot there and we won't go into it right now. Okay, so we've got our two score boxes. Put them in there, play with them until you like the way they look. And then when you're happy, let's get back to it. Okay, so we have two score boxes, but we have nothing that really controls the game right now and nothing that really controls the scores. So there are two ways we can go about this. We can have a manager that we write that's going to control the game. So when it starts, when it stops, and controls the scores. Or we can just add two score displays onto these and have them keep track independently. In other words, I can just add the score and display it without actually knowing what the score is. Now, in our case, we want to determine when a win has taken place. We want to be able to reset the scores. So I would rather keep track of the scores in a central place. So let's make a game manager. All right. Make an empty object. We'll call it game manager. Very original. And then we'll go add component here. You type the name that you want and we say new script, game manager. And then when Unity is finished compiling, we'll edit our game manager. So what do we want the game manager to do? Well, for now, we just wanted to manage the scores and tell us when somebody wins and then reset the game again. Since we don't have a second player right now, let's just focus on the scores. I'm going to pause here for a moment until it's finished loading. Okay, we've finished loading. I've loaded up the game manager script to edit. If you don't remember, you can go game manager, edit script, or you can actually look for the script in your assets where it should be created automatically by Unity, and it usually drops it over here. Okay, if you can't find it there, you can always type game manager, and there we go. So there's our script. Now right now we're going to edit it, but later I would suggest that you drag this over to your scripts folder so you can keep track of all your scripts and keep them in one place. Now let's go. Take a moment here and think about how you would go about this. How would you reference your text objects so that you can set the text for them? How would you find out whether or not a score has happened, and how would you keep track of your score? All right, pause here if you want to and think about this. I'm going to jump right in here. First, I'm going to create something called max score. I'll serialize it so it's easy to change later. We'll make it a int and we'll call it, well, let's call this win score. Now, if you remember the game design doc or little summary that we did at the beginning, we decided that we would go for a score or for a situation where the first player to reach the winning score would be the winner, instead of going for most out of, let's say, 10, because as soon as one player reaches 6, basically the game is over. This makes it a little more clear. If you can play up to 10 or 5 or 3, you decide. Okay, so we have win score. Then we want a reference to our text fields. Serialized field, Textmesh Pro or TM Pro. Excuse me there. Textmesh Pro UGUI. There we go. That's a mouthful. And we go score text 1, and let's try this. Put a comma, score text 2, and if I'm right, it will serialize both of those and display them in the inspector for us. And then we want int p1 score, p2 score, and to be safe, we'll just initialize both of those to 0. Usually if you initialize an int or a float, it is 0, but who knows what will change in the language down the line, and we want to be future proof, right? Okay, so we've got that. Now, if you remember, we actually set up 2 triggers on the edge of our screen. So when the ball hits the trigger, it lets you know that it actually went through that. So where are our triggers? Here's our score trigger. There's no script on that, but if I remember correctly, our ball script actually checks to see if it's hit a trigger. Here we go. Now in our ball script, it detects whether it's hit a trigger, and then it resets its position. Now, we could either keep track of our ball, or we could keep track of our 2 triggers. So in other words, our score triggers. I think to keep things modular, that means to keep it self-contained for each one, we are going to set the triggers to have their own scripts and basically advertise an event. How do we do that? Well, let's have a look. Let's save our game manager. Come on, Unity. Okay, let's talk about Unity events. So an event is basically something that happens, and then any script that is subscribed to that event will get notified when it happens. Let's see this in action. We'll grab our 2 triggers. And we'll say score trigger. When you're making your game and you're designing your game, try to think of ways to separate things out so that each thing only has to do 1 or 2 things. In other words, keep it doing its own job and not let one thing do everybody's jobs. That way, if you change something in one place, it's not going to affect a lot of other places, which is important because if your project starts to get a little big and you break one script, you might break a lot of stuff. It also makes it easier to find your faults. All right, so here we've got our score trigger. We can remove those because we won't be needing them. And we'll declare a public Unity event. And I think in this case, we'll make it an event with the type int. On score. Okay, let me talk about this for a moment. Unity events can have a type or they can have no type. Now, when you get a type like this, that means that when the event gets triggered, it's going to send a parameter into the function, kind of like we have here. This is the parameter coming in, and we can use that. If it doesn't have, then it will be empty, like this update function. So you won't be receiving any information when it gets called. I've made this an int simply because I want to be able to tell the event subscriber or whoever's listening to the event which one of the two players actually scored. And to do that, we're going to declare another int, and we'll call this our player ID. We'll put something here to tell our designers what's going on. So our player ID, we use tooltip. Oops, that's not a tooltip. There we go. You go tooltip and you put the string in there. The number that scored. Keeping it simple. Okay, then we'll go on trigger enter. Remember, on trigger enter 2D because we're working with 2D physics and colliders. If you use on trigger enter without the 2D, you won't get any messages from your ball entering this trigger. And when it enters, we want to check if it's actually the ball. So the collider 2D that you get in here is actually the collider from our ball. So we can grab that collision dot game object dot get component ball. So we'll say if it actually does have a component ball that is not equal to null, then we trigger our event. So if something else hits this collider, which would be unlikely because players on rails and everything else, but in future you might have more dynamic games, then we check, and if it does have a ball component, it means it's a ball, and we'll trigger our event. And then all we need to do here is to say on scored, and I'm going to do something there, which I'll explain now. Player ID. There we go. So I put this little question mark here. This is like a null check. So if onScore doesn't have anybody subscribed to the event, it won't invoke it. Otherwise, it's going to trigger that event or invoke it and pass in the player ID. So what does that mean for us? That means if we are subscribed to this event and player 1 score trigger, which would have this player ID of 1, calls this, it's going to let whoever's listening know that onScored was triggered, and it's going to pass in a value of 1 for them to do with whatever they need. Same applies for the score trigger that's on the side for player 2. Now, our game manager obviously wants to know this, so first we're going to go score triggers. Now what did I do here? I could have gone score trigger and score trigger 1, score trigger 2, or I could have declared it like this with an array where you would then go and run through the different score triggers. So if you had a game where you could, I don't know, have players on 4 sides playing Pong at the same time, you could have a score trigger on the upper wall and the lower wall and have the players defend, and you could basically just go with a for statement and run through this so you could score all of the triggers, all of the players correctly. In this case, I think we'll simplify and just go score trigger 1, comma, score trigger 2. That also makes this int that I'm passing in a little unnecessary, but we'll keep it so we can be a little bit more flexible in future. Okay, so we've got our score triggers here. Now we want to tell our game manager to listen to those score triggers. So we'll go score trigger 1 dot, and now we look for that public event, and it's not there. Oh, that's because I'm checking score text. Let's try that again. Score trigger dot on scored dot add listener, and now we need to give it a function that's going to listen. So let's just say score. I'm gonna do that, put my cursor there, and we'll just go Alt Enter, and we'll ask Visual Studio to generate that for us. There we go. We'll say, call this player number. Okay, so what's going to happen now is we're going to listen to score trigger 1, and if it gets triggered, it's going to call this function and tell us that player 1 has scored. We'll increment the score for player 1 and we'll update the score display. All right, let's do the same quickly for player 2. This, by the way, is something that Visual Studio has added. So if we forgot to implement this function, it'll throw an error for us and say that it's not implemented. We definitely plan to put some code in there, so we can delete this. Let's duplicate here. Okay. Now I think you can see how this could have been done different by just having a score 2 and score 1 function. But it gets a little clumsy after a while, so this is how I prefer to do it. And then we can just basically go yeah, we'll do this way. There's a better way to do it, but let's do it this way for now. If player number is equals 1, then P1 score plus plus, so we increment the score, and then we can just say score text 1 dot text equals P1 score to string. Okay, and then of course we'll just say else do the same with player 2. So basically, if it comes in and let's just fix that. Comes in and player number is 1, then player 1 score gets incremented and the score for player 1 gets set. Otherwise, player 2 score gets incremented and its display is set. Okay, now finally we'll check for a win. If player 1 score is greater than or equal to winning score, or Now, this OR on my keyboard is basically above the backslash button next to my enter. You might have to find this, but it's shift and press that backslash button. Or if player 2 score is bigger, then we're going to win. For now, we'll just say someone won. We'll implement that later. Okay, so we basically receiving our score, we increment it, and then if one of them went over, we'll say somebody won, and we'll reset the scores. So score, player 1 score, and player 2 score equals 0. Oh, Unity doesn't, or Visual Studio does not like that. Alright, just separate them out. And then we basically just reset those scores. Okay, let's go set everything up in our editor and see if it works. That's going to call there. While we wait for that, always remember, if you like what I do, then okay, there we go. Now let's first look at our score triggers. Now player 1 in this case is over here. So if he scores, that means this player would have missed. So this would be player 1 score trigger, and yeah, this one over here is player 1 score trigger. So we'll set that to 1. And the one over here would be if player 2 scored. As you get better at this, you'll find better ways of doing it, but we're trying to keep it simple right now. So let's stick to that. Then we have to go to our game manager over here, and we have lots of fields that need to be filled. So first, let's grab player 1 score, score text 1. And then score text 2. Okay, and we set that score trigger right is player 2. Well, that one doesn't actually matter because we're passing in which player scored. All right, that should be it. And then we just want to take these scores and set their initial display to 0, so that each player doesn't start with an imaginary score of 9,997. All right, let's save our scene by pressing Ctrl S, and let's play. Goes through, and our player scored. You can see every time it goes through the other side, player 1 scores. And let's see if I miss. I'm not getting a score for my other player. Why is this? What did we miss? There we just hit 10 and we reset. Something's up in the code. Let's have a look. In our console, We can see here that it was logged when our trigger left and trigger right went in. Here's our offset, and we definitely got a win. So let's just see why one of the players, which doesn't exist yet, hasn't scored. Player number equals 1, then it should be this. Otherwise, player 2 we're listening here, so that should be it. Okay, let's just log this quickly. Player plus player number has scored. All right. I also think we can take this off now. We double click on this, it takes us to where that debug statement is, and we can delete it because we know it works. Okay, file, save all. It's going to rebuild. While we wait, remember, you don't have to do everything exactly the way I do. Also, at any time, if you want to start expanding your game or trying different things, that's something you should do, because you never really learn until you actually start doing yourself. All right, I'm going to play this. The video is getting a little long, so we might have to pause it here and move on. Let's just give this one try. Player 1 has scored, player 1 has scored, that's good. And there it says player 2 has scored. But player 2's score is not incrementing. So the problem must be here. Ah, there we go. You probably spotted that before me. We've just been incrementing player 1's score all the time. Save it, run back, that should solve it. And before we test it, I'm gonna go say goodbye. And remember, my name is Moni, and I make games. If this works. That's it. I'm out. See you next time.